Thanks for joining me on episode 1100 of the Inspired Stewardship Podcast.
This is Wendy Gentry from Baker University. I encourage you to live your life from the inside out. And one way to be inspired to do that is to listen to this, the Inspired Stewardship Podcast with my friend, Scott Mater.
Our finances are not secure. It makes us feel like we are not secure. That's the underlying emotion. That's the underlying feeling that's going on. And when you recognize that means if there's a money conflict going on, that's why people react so strongly. Because at the end of the day, it feels like their personal identity is actually being attacked.
Welcome and thank you for joining us on the Inspired Stewardship Podcast. If you truly desire to become the person who God wants you to be, then you must learn to use your time, your talent, and your treasures for your true calling. In the Inspired Stewardship Podcast, you will learn to invest in yourself, invest in others, and develop your influence so that you can impact the world.
In today's episode about investing in yourself through stewarding your treasures, I talk with you about how conflict can affect your money. I share why you need to understand the feedback between conflict, communication, and finances, and I also share the reason you need to deal with the conflict rather than avoid it.
As we talk about stewarding your treasures, wouldn't it be great if you could support this podcast and do it without costing yourself an extra dime? Turns out you can. All you have to do is use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon when you're ready to make a purchase via Amazon, and a small commission will come back to support the show. If you enjoy the show when you're ready to buy from Amazon, just use inspiredstewardship.com/Amazon.
This week, as we talk about conflict, let's talk a little bit about conflict and how it affects our money. You know, the truth is that when they do surveys, they find roughly 70% of people say that they feel stressed out about something related to money. They feel frustrated or angry or deprived in some way, conflicted about their money. And if it's a couple situation, at least 30% say that money is a source of conflict and problems in their marriage or in their relationship. The interesting thing about that is if you recognize that, if 7 out of 10 people feel stressed about money and 30% of folks are having conflict with their significant others around money, there's often different ways that money can create conflict, either that's you as an individual or within your relationship. And I think it's important to recognize that the major reason why is because money isn't really just about math. It's not just about numbers. It's not a physical thing that we think about in terms of dollars and cents. Instead, money is deeply tied to our emotions. It's tied back to things that happen to us as children. It's tied back to how we feel about ourselves, whether or not we feel successful, whether or not we feel freedom, whether or not we feel secure. All of these sorts of emotions come up within us whenever we're dealing with money. And then if you've got a couple situation, each of you have your own set of emotions and history and experiences related to money. I really think that 30% of people feeling that it creates conflict in their relationship is less about the other 70% feeling that it doesn't, and more that they're just not even talking about that. In truth, that over in divorce, money is listed as one of the major causes of divorce because people have different spending habits. People have different beliefs about money. People have different fears about money. And the truth is, if you don't communicate about those things, if you don't talk about them in a way that doesn't create more conflict, then it adds to the conflict that you feel. Because conflict, communication, and finances are all emotional issues that are interrelated. Because what ends up happening a lot of times is there's a difference in how we approach our finances that is seen as a conflict. And then if we begin to fight about it, if that communication is not an open discussion without the emotion involved, but focused on what's going on and why do you feel that way, not in a factual attacking way, but in a recognition that we've got different perceptions, different beliefs. Even if we've been married a long time, we probably don't see everything exactly the same way. And when you recognize that and begin to communicate in a more open way, then it begins to lower some of the stress. But you have to recognize that our finances are a lot, often for many of us, tied deeply to security issues, emotional issues, feelings of worth. And so whenever our finances are not secure, it makes us feel like we are not. That's the underlying emotion. That's the underlying feeling that's going on. And when you recognize that that means if there's a money conflict going on, that's why people react so strongly, because at the end of the day, it feels like their personal identity is actually being attacked. Who they are and what is their personal worth is being attacked. Not just some sort of thing, I can't get the item that I want. It's less about the what can I purchase or what can I not purchase, and more about how does it make me feel on a deep level? So I often, whenever I'm working with clients, we start working on finances, but over time, inevitably, other things come up around communication, around identity, around deep feelings of worth, because our money is tied intimately to those emotions. And when you recognize that, then you begin to recognize that even if there's something relatively small that's going on, that at first glance, you're like, this really isn't that big of a deal, you probably actually still need to deal with it. Because over time, that small disagreement creates a growing conflict. And that growing conflict is going to slowly create a wedge until eventually that conflict has grown to such an extent that you end up being one of those statistics that I was quoting earlier. The divorce that says that money fights and money issues was one of the causes of us splitting our relationship up. When you recognize that these sorts of identity issues are deeper, then you can recognize that it's no longer just looking at a number or looking at a budget. Instead, it's about making decisions and identifying our values and then getting in alignment. And if you're an individual and you've got conflict with your money, it's about digging in and doing the hard work to make sure that you really understand not just the math, but the why behind the math. Because that why is always more important than the numbers. As a coach, the doing the budget part, somebody can Google. That's not hard. But really digging in and figuring out what's important to you and why it's important and how you can achieve it, that is the hard work. That is the powerful work. That is the work that often we look at and go, oh, yeah, that's not that big of a deal. And yet that's the source and the solution to the conflict that you may feel. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to the Inspired Stewardship podcast. As a subscriber and listener, we challenge you to not just sit back and passively listen, but act on what you've heard and find a way to live your calling. If you like this episode on the stewardship of treasures, you can sign up for our treasures tips by going to inspiredstewardship.com/treasures or text in the U.S. 44222 treasures tips. And we'll send you 5 weeks of our best tips on stewarding your treasures. Until next time, invest your time, your talent, and your treasures. Develop your influence and impact the world.